Doug had been my closest friend for as long as I could remember. We met back in high school where he stood out as the brightest student in our class, while I, Stan, hovered around the top rankings. Though he took an unconventional route, leaving college after just a year, Doug's sharp mind and talent for finance never ceased to amaze me. By our late 20s, Doug had already amassed a fortune, turning a modest inheritance into a significant wealth through diligent self-study and smart investments. Unlike others with similar fortunes, he never showed off. Instead, he used his resources to create a luxurious but inviting home where friends, including my wife Heather and me, could gather. Heather, my vibrant partner of 4 years, had a way of bringing light to any room she entered. From the moment we met, I was drawn to her quick wit and infectious laugh, though our life together had its occasional challenges. I never doubted that those years were some of my happiest. That evening, Doug was hosting his big New Year's Eve party, an event that had become an annual tradition. I looked forward to spending the night in a lively atmosphere, reconnecting with old friends, and most of all, sharing moments of joy and renewal with Heather by my side. I walked up to Doug's front door and rang the bell, feeling a rush of excitement as I pulled Heather close for a quick kiss. Her smile, her warmth, these were moments I held dear. The sound of music and the hum of voices hinted at the size of the crowd inside. Doug's parties were always big, but tonight's turnout seemed even grander. When the door finally opened, there he stood, his face breaking into a wide grin as he waved us in. The number of cars outside had been a clue, but seeing the sea of guests confirmed it. Tonight was going to be unforgettable. Just as I was about to ring the bell again, Doug opened the door and greeted us loudly, welcoming us inside. I had guessed from the number of parked cars that the party would be huge, but I was still surprised by the crowd in his home. Doug gave Heather a warm hug and a light kiss on the cheek before guiding her in. He then shook my hand and stepped aside so I could enter. A maid took our coats and disappeared with them. Doug walked with us, saying, "It's so great to see you both. I don't love having parties this big, but I feel obligated to invite everyone. Business or social ties bind me to most guests, except for a few good friends like you two. Clarissa is around here somewhere, probably dodging wandering hands as usual." The night continued. Heather and I danced, ate, and drank more than we should have. We didn't mind because we knew we had a room upstairs for when we needed it. We were among the few invited to stay the night, so we didn't have to worry about driving or finding a cab or having one of us stay sober. I worked in the investment field, and I was one of the top brokers in my office and ranked in the top quarter of brokers company-wide. So I was familiar with many guests in the room. I agreed with Doug's sentiments. Quite a few were unpleasant characters. Heather, being as beautiful as she was, had to fend off attention, much like Doug's Clarissa. Throughout the night, I used the time to network, greeting clients and reaching out to potential new ones. I kept an eye on Heather as the evening wore on. Though I completely trusted her, I couldn't help feeling a bit jealous. I made a point to step in when I saw men trying to charm her a bit too much. Each time I did, Heather rewarded me with a smile and a soft kiss, whispering, "Thank you," or "Thanks for saving me, honey." This evening was no different. I approached whenever I saw her trying to escape unwanted attention, and she would thank me with a smile, a hug, or a kiss on the cheek. We'd talk for a bit, dance or drink together, and then go our separate ways. As the night wore on and guests began to leave, only those staying until midnight remained. I noticed a particular man who seemed to be following Heather, his eyes never leaving her. He was fixated, clearly smitten, and seized every chance to stay close. At first, Heather ignored him or walked away, but as the night went on, she started lingering near him, even smiling or laughing at his comments. Occasionally, she would touch his forearm lightly. This wasn't typical of Heather. She never flirted that long with any man, especially a stranger. Doug caught me watching them just before midnight and came over. "That's Jonathan Douglas with Heather. He's a real idiot, a top-tier ladies' man. I didn't even invite him. One of the women I invited brought him as her date. I haven't seen them together since you and Heather arrived." Doug stood next to me, scanning the room carefully. A curious expression crossed his face. "Actually, it seems like Douglas's date already left tonight." She watched him follow Heather around for a bit, then I saw them having a pretty heated conversation. I haven't seen her since. "He's bad news, Stan, trouble with a capital T. He's married, but they're practically living apart. He preys on married women or anyone he thinks he can take advantage of. Strangely enough, he's already wealthy. Watch out for him. He could charm a nun and make her believe it was her idea and she's in love with him." For the third time that night, I walked over to separate Heather and Jonathan. He shot me a glare like he had before when I interrupted. I took Heather aside with a dismissive comment as we walked away. This time, Heather didn't thank me. She gave me a frustrated look and said, "Stan, what's wrong with you tonight? You could have just told me. I was enjoying talking to Jonathan. Why did you feel the need to pull me away? He's not like the usual creeps you save me from. He's really interesting with great stories. He's running for mayor and was sharing what it's like dealing with people during his campaign. When he found out I worked in public information and advertising, he started asking for advice on reaching voters. I think he might even offer me a job. Honey, I really need to stay in touch with him. Just think of what it could mean if I landed a role in his administration." "I don't care, Heather. I don't trust him, and I don't like him being near you. Doug says he's trouble, and I've heard bad things about him too. I want you to stay safe. From what I hear, the kind of job he's suggesting comes with strings attached." Heather looked at me, anger flashing across her face. I worried I'd gone too far, but then she smiled. Leaning in, she kissed my cheek and said, "Ah, that's sweet. I think you're actually jealous. But don't worry, sweetie, you're all mine." Later, as we mingled, I realized she had said I was all hers, not that she was all mine. That thought made me pause, wondering if I'd said too much or if she was hinting at something deeper. 3 months later, that night replayed vividly in my mind. The past 2 months had been turbulent at home. Not long after the party, Heather started coming home late from meetings or visits with her parents. When I asked, she'd become defensive or angry, saying she lost track of time or needed to finish a project. She also started volunteering at the local Republican Party, which took up more of her evening. Heather was known for her exceptional management skills and quickly became the volunteer office manager at the campaign headquarters, helping with informational strategies. From what I gathered, she brought order and became a popular volunteer, much like a husband unaware he's being deceived. With her increased absences, I noticed our closeness suffered. Rejections became more frequent. She always had reasons. She was tired, it was too late, or we were short on time, but it was clear. One day I confided in Doug about my marriage struggles. He gave me a worried look and finally said, "Stan, I'm concerned. I might be part of why your marriage has been strained recently. I heard Jonathan found another married woman. Word is he met her at a New Year's Eve party, and we both know where he was that night and who he spent time with. The rumor says she's also volunteering on his mayoral campaign." A wave of dizziness hit me, and I felt my breath catch. Doug noticed and kept talking. "Stan, what's wrong? You just went pale." I looked at Doug and said, "Heather started volunteering at the Republican Party office about an hour after work. On Saturdays, she always comes home late and refuses to share what she's been doing. Whenever I bring it up, she becomes defensive and angry. Lately, she even gets mad when I approach her in the evenings." Doug leaned back in his chair, pressing his lips together for a moment before saying, "Stan, I'm going to find out what's going on. And let's just say, if he's abusing my hospitality by getting involved with my best friend's wife, there will be consequences. I'd be furious if he pursued any married woman at one of my parties, but taking advantage of my hospitality by targeting your wife is unforgivable. I should have made him leave when his date left, but I was too focused on being a good host. If I've caused you trouble, my friend, I'll do everything I can to make it right. Let me tell you more about Doug. He's my best friend, someone I'd trust with my life, someone I'd even trust around my wife. He would never intentionally hurt me, and we were closer than brothers. Doug is exceptionally intelligent, probably the smartest person I've ever met. We were in the same high school class. He was the valedictorian, while I barely made it into the top 10 out of 223 students. He only attended 1 year of college before deciding it was a waste of time. Despite skipping classes and never studying, he still maintained a 4.0 GPA. Eventually, he took a few finance courses and then taught himself everything he needed to know about investing and finance. Doug's reason for learning business and finance was due to an inheritance of just over $70,000 from his grandparents during his freshman year. Unlike most young people, he didn't waste the money. He upgraded to a better used pickup truck and invested the rest in the stock market. He bought his first 2 stocks based on a broker's advice. They didn't perform well, and only the broker and the firm profited. This experience frustrated Doug, so he began to study the market. He watched CNBC, read extensively, and conducted research. He opened an account at a discount brokerage, moved all his savings there, and began investing on his own. From his first independent trade, Doug started making money, far more than he did with the so-called experts. It helped that he began during the late 1980s tech boom and dot-com era. He rode the waves of volatile stocks, and although not every investment was profitable, he significantly grew his capital. He had the foresight to switch to safer stocks when things got rough, benefiting from the market's upward trends. Doug bought Berkshire Hathaway at just over $17,000 per share and sold it 3 years later at $72,357 per share. By then, he was a multimillionaire, investing with others in venture capital and real estate. I graduated college and worked as a salesman for a restaurant chain for 4 years. I didn't enjoy the travel and wanted to be serious with Heather, so I transitioned into becoming a stockbroker. Doug entrusted me with managing a portion of his wealth when I started, likely to support a friend, which made me feel guilty. I knew he didn't need my advice, but it felt charitable. Doug convinced me he needed me, citing 2 reasons. He wanted to spread his investments across multiple brokerages for security, and believed having someone inside the industry might uncover valuable information before he did. While we never considered anything close to insider trading, I occasionally found useful insights for him. We both thrived. Doug referred many friends and acquaintances who wanted full-service brokerage help, which boosted my income through deals I made. Doug didn't work outside his home. He spent 8 to 10 hours daily studying stocks and trading, but only for himself. He led an extravagant life and tried to include Heather and me in his social circle. We attended numerous charity events with him, often at his expense. Sometimes I covered the bills with my expense account as a broker. We joined him at political events, mingling with influential people in our community. And of course, we attended every party Doug hosted at his house. Friday night after my talk with Doug, we went to a $500 a plate political rally with him and his companion. Once again, Doug treated Heather and me to the meal. This time, Heather seemed even more hesitant to join us than usual. Unfortunately, I insisted she come, and I regret that decision to this day. I suppose the disaster our marriage was heading toward would have happened once Doug's investigators reported back on Heather. But at least I would have stayed in the dark a bit longer. That dinner marked the beginning of the end. When we arrived, we realized we were at an event where the incumbent state Senate candidate was speaking to support other state and local candidates. The money for the tickets went to the state Republican Party, with some funds directed to local campaigns. What I didn't know was that the special guest would be a mayoral candidate for our city, Jonathan Douglas. When we entered, I saw Jonathan at the front of the room, smiling and talking with dignitaries. Heather pulled away slightly, and I turned to see her staring at Jonathan, her face glowing like someone in love. That's when I suspected I had lost her. "What?" I asked. Heather flinched, giving me a weak smile. "I'm sorry, honey. I didn't know this was his event." She looked so guilty that I questioned if she was being truthful, but said nothing. She must have known Jonathan would be there, given her part-time work at campaign headquarters. Now I understood her reluctance to come. I glanced at Doug, who had been observing us. He turned to look at Jonathan, then smiled and guided Heather to a chair, helping her sit down before seating Clarissa to his left. As I passed Doug, he said, "I'm sorry, Stan. I didn't know he'd be part of this when I invited you. I saw her reaction. I hope I'm wrong. But I have a meeting set for Monday with someone I want you to meet. Can we do lunch at 11:30? Heather finished her meal and excused herself to the restroom. I noticed Jonathan slipping out through another door. I thought for a moment, then stood to follow. Doug grabbed my shoulder. "No, Stan, let it go. If it's true, it's too late anyway. Just wait until Monday, please." Later that night, I lost track of Heather again. After returning from the restroom, I went searching and found myself backstage. I heard low voices and soft moans. One of them was unmistakably Heather's. Anger surged as I moved toward the sounds, tripping over a rope and making noise. Heather's voice broke the silence. "Oh, someone's coming. I need to go." Jonathan responded quickly, his tone urgent. "Honey, if we get caught now, it'll be bad for both of us. I'll see you at the office. I love you." A brief kiss followed, then the sound of hurried footsteps fading away. I rushed after them but was too late to confirm what I suspected, that it was Heather and Jonathan. As I turned back, I ran into Doug, who looked furious. He grabbed my arm, forcing me to stop and face him. "Stan, I warned you to stay out of this," Doug snapped. "My team needs time to gather evidence before you do something reckless. If she's cheating, and I believe she is, we need proof so you can handle this smartly and come out ahead in a divorce if that's what you choose. The way you're going, you'll only hurt yourself in court." After calming me a bit, Doug said, "I saw them heading down another hallway. They stopped at a door and she looked around for you. When she didn't see you, she got scared and told him she thought you were searching for them. Now he's suspicious, and it'll be harder for you to expose him." When Doug and I returned to the table, we put on a show, making sure Heather and the others noticed us laughing and sharing a pocket flask. Heather's eyes flicked to me as I sat beside her and asked, "Where have you two been?" Clarissa wrapped her arms around Doug, smiling mischievously. "Next time I catch you two sneaking out for a drink, I'm either joining or turning you in. Now, pass that flask." We exchanged glances as Heather visibly relaxed. She turned to Clarissa, curiosity in her voice. "Is that what they were doing? I was wondering where they went when I couldn't find them." Clarissa laughed, adding, "Oh yes, I tried to catch them to claim my share before they got back, but they were too quick for me." Later, during the dance, I had my turn with Clarissa. She leaned in close, and when I tried to glance around the room, she held me steady, keeping my attention on her. She kissed my cheek lightly and whispered, "No, Stan, don't look over there. Just dance with me, and try to enjoy tonight. I know what you're going through, and it's only going to get worse. Just remember, Doug and I are here for you, and always." I relaxed a bit and returned her kiss gently. "Thanks for helping keep things light. I nearly lost my cool, and Doug says that would be a huge mistake. I want to tear that idiot apart so badly, I can't stand it." The following days and weekend were difficult. I cycled between fear and anger. Deep down, I realized Heather had already emotionally distanced herself from me, and it was only a matter of time before she left physically. We hadn't been a happy couple for weeks. I started pulling back emotionally, even though I didn't have concrete proof she was cheating. If she wasn't, then something else was wrong, because we weren't the same loving couple we used to be. Finally, the day of my meeting with Doug and his friend arrived. I suspected this friend would be a private investigator. Anxiety churned in my stomach, and I felt sick. My anger simmered, and I knew they could both see it. I was terrified of what I might find out, but also desperate to know the truth. Doug stood to greet me as I approached, shook my hand, and hugged me. After the greetings, he introduced me to Simon Hobbs, an investigator. We sat for a moment, scanning the menu before placing our orders. Once the waitress left, Doug said, "Let's get the unpleasant part over with, shall we?" He glanced at Simon and then at me. Simon opened his briefcase and took out a large envelope, handing it to me. "We've been monitoring your wife and Mr. Douglas at Doug's request. Surveillance lasted 20 days, ending last Saturday night. In that time, we discovered they had lunch together daily, except Sundays when she stayed home. These lunches were held at various upscale hotels, followed by trips to a room rented by Mr. Douglas's campaign. On 8 separate occasions, we entered the room posing as room service staff. Each time, the bed was clearly used. Photos and documentation are in the report. We also made audio recordings by placing a microphone under the door. They engaged in intimate activities during each hotel visit." Simon continued. "We also noted inappropriate interactions at or after the campaign office on multiple occasions. We photographed them together 3 times at the office and once at a local bar event with friends and supporters. The most significant discovery was how Mr. Douglas used your wife to gain support from the Municipal Employees Union. They met with Union President Stephen Negrano at a gentleman's club. He seemed very taken with your wife, and we captured photos of her sitting on his lap." Simon paused before adding, "My team managed to record this interaction. Listen to this segment. Then we'll discuss it further." He placed a small laptop on the table and played the audio. "You'll receive this DVD with your report, but I wanted to talk this over before we end today. My operative was quite confident this would interest your attorney." Doug and I leaned in, watching and listening closely. In the footage, Heather sat between Jonathan and Stephen, with both men leaning in to speak to her, Jonathan's hands roaming. Heather could be heard saying, "Stop that." But Jonathan replied, "Heather, you know you like this. Just relax and go with it. It's not as if anyone will notice here. Jonathan leaned in and kissed her while Stephen said, "Jonathan, you know what's needed for the union's support. I want a weekend with this lady. If I get that, the union will back your campaign." Heather stiffened and tried to stand, whispering sharply, "No, that's not happening. Let go of me." Stephen looked at Jonathan, raising an eyebrow. Jonathan swallowed and leaned into Heather, saying, "We really need this, honey. Just go along and help me out. It's for our future, and it's not like you haven't done this before. Just tell your husband you have a work meeting this weekend." On the video, Heather looked shocked, resisted briefly, and then visibly relaxed. We saw the undeniable proof of her betrayal. Around this time, the club manager approached their table, glancing nervously at Heather and the men beside her. He stuttered as he spoke. "Mr. Negrano, I've done a lot for you, but I've been warned that you and the others have become too noticeable. Lieutenant Jones said the chief is sending detectives here to crack down on scenes like this. If we're caught, I'll be jailed. Could you please move this to a back room or the hotel? This business is my livelihood." Stephen laughed and turned to the large man on the other side of the table. "Hey, Ralph, give Joe a couple thousand for his trouble. The lady and I are heading to the DoubleTree for the weekend. Get it set up like a union leadership meeting, the usual way." I felt a surge of anger and started to rise. That lying woman. She told me she had an emergency work project and was flying to San Francisco last weekend. Doug and Simon quickly pulled me back into my seat. Simon said, "Hold on, sir. Let me fast forward to show you one more segment, and then you can read the full report. We need to talk about some of this, but I thought you'd want to see the DVD first." My operative stopped recording at the club and called for backup. They reached the DoubleTree Hotel ahead of the group. When the men checked in, my operatives, dressed in hotel uniforms, followed them. After the room was inspected, my team entered and set up flowers, pillows, and other items. Simon smiled as he explained. The older man even sent his assistant for fresh flowers and champagne to give them an excuse to linger in the room. We managed to install cameras and microphones in the main room and both bedrooms. By the time your wife and Stanley returned, they were drunk. The footage captured everything. Simon resumed the DVD on his laptop. Heather and Stanley entered the suite and shut the door, heading to the bedroom where they engaged in intimate activities. Simon turned off the video and looked at me. "Your wife stayed in that room until checkout on Monday. During that time, she was involved with several senior union officials, including Stephen. Late Saturday night, Jonathan joined them, and he, the director, and Stephen spent most of the night with her. We have footage of them plotting the misuse of union funds to back Jonathan's campaign, and pictures of Senator Nussbaum and 2 judges joining in with Heather and Jonathan. Records indicate that he traded her favors for endorsements." The investigator paused before continuing. "During your attempt to confront your wife and Douglas at the election dinner, they were about to engage in inappropriate behavior backstage when she heard you and stopped him. They ran when they realized you were close. We have images from that incident, and it would have been better if you hadn't intervened. Photos of that situation would have been highly damaging. At least you didn't get caught or create a scene that could have hurt your case. We've compiled the entire report and can share it with your attorney if needed. Our investigation fees cover any necessary court testimony. I'd suggest continued surveillance for potential criminal charges. Although this is typically police work, presenting documented misuse of campaign funds and conspiracy to the authorities and the FBI will make them take it seriously. Plus, if you file for divorce and your wife ends up prosecuted, you'll be in a better position for a favorable settlement." Despite expecting this, I was stunned and distressed. The level of betrayal Heather demonstrated during surveillance was staggering. The documents revealed she believed she was in love with Jonathan and was planning her departure from me. She spoke excitedly about the role she was promised in his administration if he won the mayoral race. What shocked me most was her willingness to spend the weekend at the DoubleTree and the extent of what she did for Jonathan and his associates. I always knew Heather was ambitious and admired by influential people, but I couldn't believe she'd go to such lengths to get what she wanted. I felt almost physically sick. I hadn't eaten much, and I noticed Doug hadn't either. After the investigator left, we each had a few drinks. We sat in silence for a while, deep in thought, until Doug spoke. "Stan, I'm sorry for wrecking your marriage. I take full responsibility for your troubles and will do my best to make it up to you. I know I can't undo what happened, but I'll help in any way I can. I'll find you a good lawyer if... No, not just for the divorce. I'll give you whatever support you need until you're back to how you were before, as much as possible." I pushed back from the table and looked at Doug, "Then start finding a lawyer." I was almost ready to give her an ultimatum, either stop this behavior or we're getting a divorce. even before I knew for sure she was cheating. Now, there's no way I'm letting her walk away unscathed. I can't believe she did those things. I wonder when she changed or if I ever really knew her at all. As for everything else, I continued, Heather's cheating isn't your fault, and you don't owe me anything for it. On Thursday, Doug called and said, Stan, I found a top-notch lawyer for you. She has a real passion for taking down cheaters and always sides with the innocent in divorce cases. She can't stand public figures and businessmen who misuse their power to cheat. If you play this right, you can not only leave Heather and keep most of your assets, but also take Jonathan down. Doug gave me her name and number, and I called that afternoon to set up a consultation. When I mentioned my name, the assistant said they'd been expecting my call and offered an appointment for 9 a.m. the next morning. I accepted and was given a list of items to bring and information to prepare. When I arrived, I was promptly shown into the office. My new attorney, Sally, made a strong impression, and we quickly got into a comfortable discussion about my goals for the divorce. I told her, I want to come out of this marriage with everything I have. I know that's unlikely, but that's my goal. And I want to sue the man who stole my wife for everything possible. I want him to lose the election and end up with nothing. Sally leaned back in her chair, rocking slightly as she considered the situation. A small smile crossed her lips. Do you really want this? Or do you want to financially ruin him, destroy his reputation, and send him to prison? If we handle this strategically, we could probably get him jail time. I've read part of the investigator's report, and it's very compelling. I'm sorry for what you're going through, but the evidence is strong enough to take down most of the major players involved in this mess. Plus, I'm obligated to share the report with the authorities since federal laws were violated. If we notify them first and then file for divorce, it'll hit him harder. But if you file for divorce first, he'll have time to escape or delay the fallout. I clenched my fists, my voice steady with anger. I don't care how it's done, as long as it hurts him and everyone else involved. Heather is absolutely guilty. There's no doubt about it. From what I saw, he pursued her relentlessly until she finally gave in. She always wore her wedding ring, so he knew she was married. I even heard tapes where they mocked me and talked about their plans for when she would leave me. Sally and I went over all the details, and I made my decision. I instructed her to prepare and file the divorce papers right away. We agreed that the investigator's report should be handed over to the FBI to initiate an investigation into campaign finance violations and misuse of union and city funds. Sally advised me to accompany the bailiff when Heather was served and when Mr. Douglas was warned of the impending lawsuit. If he acts like most powerful people, he'll either threaten you, try to have you fired, or threaten a countersuit, she said. Stand firm, and he may try to settle with you in secret. If he does, depending on where the funds come from, we could pursue additional campaign law charges. Politicians often try to use campaign funds to cover things up, so be ready for that possibility. Sally reached into her desk and handed me a small microphone and recorder. She said, I want you to carry this with you at all times and keep it on. Hide the microphone in your hair and keep the recorder in your car. The transmitter's range is about half a mile. If your car is out of range, the microphone can record up to 6 hours. Once you're within range, the recordings will automatically download. If you give me your keys, I'll have someone install the recorder in your car while we finish up here. Also, I suggest either rehiring your private investigator or letting me find one to continue monitoring your wife and Mr. Douglas. I've learned that Mrs. Malone isn't the first married woman he's pursued, and when caught, he has tried illegal ways to cover it up. If we capture their plans on tape this time, we can really corner both him and your wife. I smiled and said, The detective suggested the same thing. I'm keeping him on standby. On Thursday morning, Sally called me. Mr. Malone, we're ready to file the divorce papers and serve them to your wife. Do you still want to attend and make your remarks? Oh, absolutely, I replied. I might even get some satisfaction out of it. I was also thinking, shouldn't we serve her at campaign headquarters this Friday night? There was a pause before Sally responded, No, Stan, I don't think that's a good idea. If you serve her there and make your statements, everyone at the campaign will know about it almost instantly. It'll be in the newspapers the next day, and Mr. Douglas, feeling cornered and publicly humiliated, won't have any incentive to retaliate or try to make a deal. I suggest serving her when she's alone or just with him. I nodded, understanding her point. I see what you mean. Why don't we follow them and see if they go out alone tomorrow night? Heather usually doesn't come home until almost midnight on Fridays. According to the investigator's report, they often spend Friday nights at a hotel, the same one they visit during the day. Could we serve them there and maybe catch them in the act? Sally agreed, and we planned for the bailiff and me to interrupt their meeting at the hotel room Friday night. When I entered my office, 2 men in suits were waiting for me. They introduced themselves and said they wanted to discuss managing some funds for their widowed mother. I invited them in, but after I closed the door, they showed me their FBI badges. They wanted to talk about my interest in Jonathan, as they were building a case based on the material my lawyer had provided. When they learned I planned to join the bailiff and record the event, they asked if I would wear one of their recording devices. This made me uneasy, as I worried it might affect my chances of securing a financial settlement from Jonathan. However, I couldn't find a good reason to refuse, so I agreed to wear their wire. That night, we followed the unsuspecting couple from campaign headquarters to the hotel. They left at 7 p.m. and were in the room by 7:30. Our group was so large it felt like a convoy, and I worried they might notice. After they checked into the hotel, we waited nearly an hour. I had brought my camera to document the moment. Even though I'm not one for home videos, this was an exception. Just as we prepared to knock on the door, we got an unexpected break. The elevator opened and a waiter stepped out with a cart. He approached the room and looked at us curiously. I smiled, pointed to the door, and said, "Go on in. We didn't mean to interrupt Mr. Douglas's dinner. We'll be right behind you." The waiter smiled back. "No problem," he said. He knocked, announced room service, and when Jonathan opened the door, he entered. The process server and I waited until the waiter came out. When he did, I moved to keep the door from closing. The process server and I slipped inside quietly. We stood near the door, hidden from view, and waited for Jonathan and Heather to begin their meal before stepping into full view. When we stepped into the room, I was slightly ahead of the others. The scene in front of me left me shocked, horrified, and heartbroken. Even though I had seen the investigators' report, witnessing it firsthand was different. Both of them looked euphoric. Finally, I nodded to the process server who stepped into the room. The process server stepped forward and asked, "Are you Jonathan Douglas and Heather Malone?" Heather gasped, and Jonathan's face contorted with anger as he stood abruptly. "Yes, you idiot, I am. Now get out of my hotel room. How did you even get in here?" "Sir, the room service waiter let us in as he left. Didn't you hear us ask if we could come in? I thought you had invited us." The process server moved closer and handed Heather the divorce papers. "You have been served," he said firmly. I stepped further into the room, and Heather's eyes widened as she noticed me for the first time. "Stan, damn you, what are you doing here? And what is this divorce? If you don't stop this madness, you'll end up with nothing. I'll take it all." "No, Heather, you won't," I said coldly. "If you know what's good for you, you'll sign the papers and accept the deal I offered. Once I'm through with you, I'm going after him. I'm going to sue Jonathan and his campaign for mental anguish and alienation of affection. Lucky for me, we live in a state that still allows those kinds of lawsuits. And as a bonus, this will put a dent in his election campaign. You're about to lose everything." Heather didn't come home that night, and I heard nothing from her until the following Wednesday. That morning, my office phone rang, and her voice came through the line, cold and direct. "Jonathan and I want to meet to discuss this situation. We've booked a meeting room at the Doubletree Hotel for tonight. We want to resolve this and move forward. Be there at 7. There was no invitation, just an expectation. I called Sally to inform her of the call and then reached out to my FBI contact. Both Sally and the FBI advised me to attend. Sally assured me she would come along, and the FBI said they'd have support nearby if needed. When I arrived at the hotel, the receptionist directed me to a small meeting room down the hall. A large man stood guard at the entrance, blocking my way as I approached. "There's a private meeting in progress, sir," he said firmly. "I'm Stan Malone, and I'm expected," I replied. He scrutinized my ID before giving a nod. Turning to the door, he knocked twice. The door creaked open just enough for him to speak through the gap. "Mr. Malone is here, sir," he announced. I couldn't hear the response, but the door closed. The guard then said, "I need to search you. Please empty your pockets into the tray." After complying, I became annoyed and demanded an explanation for the search. The guard smirked and said, "Political figures have enemies, sir, and Mr. Douglas doesn't want any risks." I suspected they were looking for recording devices, but didn't comment. My hair was long enough to hide the small transmitters glued to my scalp. After the search, it took about 5 minutes before the door opened, allowing me to enter. Heather was sitting at the table, looking at me with guilt written all over her flushed face. Anger bubbled up in me as I processed what she had likely done. Jonathan sat there smirking, his eyes gleaming, clearly relishing the fact that he had just been with my wife. The meeting played out just as Sally and I expected. Jonathan threatened me, first with losing my job, and then with physical damage if I didn't offer Heather a better settlement and drop my plans for lawsuits against him and his campaign. I leaned back in my chair and said, "Listen, mister, I know you and your friends might manage to hurt or even eliminate me, but that won't save you. I've taken every precaution and prepared multiple packages to be mailed out. If anything happens to me or my family, even if I'm in an accident, those packages will be sent. You and I both know that not all media can be controlled. Some of it will get published, especially if I'm seriously hurt or liquidated. You will go down." I saw anger flash across Jonathan's face and noticed him tense. Something I had learned over the years meant Heather was furious. I smiled and continued speaking. "I know what you just did before I arrived, and I have pictures of you doing it multiple times. I even have evidence of your meeting last week at the DoubleTree with union leaders and senior city officials. Do you really think they'll thank you for dragging them into this? If anything happens to me, those documents will expose them, my wife and you. We both know many of them have dangerous connections." Heather glared at me while Jonathan looked a bit unsettled. He tried to maintain his composure and said, "You heard me. Drop your threats and handle this quietly or else. Now get out. I'm done talking." I stood up, locking eyes with Jonathan until he began to look uneasy. I could tell he felt cornered. I chuckled and turned to leave, pausing at the door. "You know, Jonathan, I might reconsider if I received fair compensation in the divorce. And if the people in this town elect you, they deserve what they get." I headed straight home and found my private investigator already there with an FBI agent. They had removed their recording devices and secured them. The investigator said, "We captured everything, including Jonathan's conversation with your wife and his associates after you left. He's got someone tailing you now, tasked with watching and reporting anything suspicious. You're making him nervous." 3 days later, I made sure Jonathan's tail was nearby when I called my lawyer. We discussed the divorce, and as we wrapped up, I said, "Sally, I'm done waiting. I've told both Heather and Jonathan what I need to walk away, and they're stalling. Prepare the paperwork and file a lawsuit against Jonathan. Let's go for $10 million. That should catch his attention and make headlines." I smirked as I watched Jonathan's henchman retreat and make a frantic phone call, gesturing wildly. Without waiting for the outcome, I got in my car and drove home. That night, just as I was settling in, hunger gnawing at me since I hadn't eaten dinner, my phone rang. Jonathan's voice came through the line, careful not to mention that his man had overheard my conversation with Sally. "Listen, Malone," Jonathan began. "Heather and I talked, and we've decided to meet some of your demands. She'll sign the divorce papers as is, taking only her personal belongings and her pension. I'm prepared to offer an out-of-court settlement if you ensure this stays quiet." "Jonathan, all I can promise is that I won't be the one to leak anything," I replied, "but I can't guarantee someone else won't. There are likely hundreds of people who already know about your involvement with my wife." Jonathan's voice tightened. "Fine. Here's the deal. You sign a non-disclosure agreement and I'll transfer $1 million into your account. No questions asked. Heather will file the divorce papers and agree to your terms." I chuckled. "That's a small offer, Jonathan. My lawyer just filed a $10 million personal injury suit. I might not get the full amount, but you'll need to offer more than $1 million for me to consider dropping it. Besides, I could make even more from book and movie deals." There was a pause before Jonathan responded, frustration seeping through. All right. I might be able to go higher, but not by much. How about $1.7 million? That's the most I can transfer without drawing attention. I'll find a way to mask it as campaign expenses, but that's my best offer." "Deal," I said. "But I won't tell my lawyer to pause any actions until the money is in my account. Here's the number for my offshore account in the Caymans." What Jonathan didn't know was that I had set up the account in his name with his mailing address. I hoped federal investigators would trace the money from his campaign to the account. I planned to transfer the money as soon as it hit, so it couldn't be retrieved. Later that evening, my doorbell rang. The same man who guarded the door at my meeting with Jonathan and Heather stood there, holding a clipboard with a one-page legal document. "Mr. Douglas asked me to bring this for you to sign," he said. I read it, then looked at him. "It looks fine, but I need to review it with my lawyer before signing." "I really shouldn't leave without it," he replied. I sighed and closed the door in his face. I went to my office and called Sally, explaining the situation. She agreed to come over and review the document. It took her nearly an hour to arrive, but after reading it, she smiled and advised me to sign. 3 days later, I confirmed that the account balance in the Cayman Islands was $1,700,000. That same day, my attorney called to inform me that Heather had signed and returned the divorce agreement, which had been filed with the court. With the divorce being uncontested, it was expected to be finalized within 30 days. I had already transferred the money from the Cayman account in case Jonathan tried to reclaim it. I moved it through multiple global transactions before depositing it in another Cayman account under a different alias. I kept working through this difficult period, but my performance suffered. My commissions dropped to almost half of what they usually were, not just due to the economy, but also because I frequently relied on coworkers to handle my clients' transactions, splitting the commissions. After the divorce was finalized, I still felt off balance. My work mistakes increased, costing me significantly. If I made a wrong trade for a client, I had to fix it. I was constantly on edge, worried about an accident orchestrated by Jonathan and his allies as retaliation. My anxiety spiked as I waited for the feds to act against everyone involved. One night, while sitting at home wondering how my life had unraveled so fast, the doorbell rang. It was already 9 p.m. When I opened the door, I saw Heather. She was crying, a large red mark on her face that would surely bruise by morning. She looked at me briefly before dropping her eyes to the floor. "Stan, please, can I talk to you?" she said. I almost refused and shut the door in her face, but curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped aside, inviting her in without a word. I led her to the living room and sat in a chair, making sure the security cameras had a clear view. I positioned her on the couch so the cameras would capture her better. Heather sat, tears streaming down her face. Finally, she spoke. "Stan, I know it's too late, but She took a shaky breath. "I need to apologize for what I did to us. I knew better, but he broke through my defenses. You know how much I love attention and ambition. He figured out exactly how to play me, and I fell hard. He seemed like my perfect match, and I couldn't resist. I was blinded by the promise of a high-profile job he said I'd get after the election. I lost sight of what we had." Her sobs grew louder. She looked at me with tear-streaked eyes. "Do you know how angry I was at you on New Year's Eve when you tried to separate us? Stan, by then it was too late. The last time you pulled me away from Jonathan, we had just returned from one of Doug's bedrooms. He convinced me to be with him less than 3 hours after we met. I'm so sorry, but within 3 weeks of sneaking around, I was all in with him. He promised he'd divorce his wife and marry me after the election, saying he couldn't do it sooner without risking his campaign. I fell for the dream of being married to a mayor, maybe even a future senator or governor." She wiped her eyes and continued. "After you caused trouble, Jonathan started pulling away. Tonight at the office, I found him in the storage room with one of the young student volunteers. You were right, Stan. He was feeding her the same lies he told me, promising to leave his wife and marry her after the election. I confronted him and he laughed at me. He asked why I thought he'd marry an old, washed-up hoe like me, especially one who'd cheated on her husband. He said if I played nice, I could stay as his social secretary, maybe entertain his important clients as I'd done before. His new fling laughed at me, and when I slapped him, he slapped me back. Stan, I know it's too late for us, but I want you to know that I finally understand. I'm truly sorry for what I did to us, to you. If there's any way you could forgive me, I'd love to try again. I always knew I had a good man, but there was something about Jonathan that I couldn't resist. The idea of living a high-profile life with him clouded my judgment. Heather looked at me for another moment as silent tears streamed down her cheeks. Then, with a hesitant smile, she stood, walked over to my chair, and kissed me gently on the cheek before running out of the room and out of the house. I sat there, stunned, before getting up and watching her car drive away. I sighed, wishing she had realized all of this before getting involved with Jonathan and his union and government allies. I turned and went back to the den. After a few days, I couldn't take the reminders and pain any longer. I decided to sell the house and hired a real estate agent to help me find a new home without the memories. I brought in a crew to pack up my belongings and send them to storage, another crew to clean the house, and one more to maintain the yard. I stayed in touch with Doug and Sally occasionally. They told me the feds were keeping the investigation under wraps, concerned about potential corruption within the police. We agreed that my name would stay out of it, and the information I provided Sally would only be used if necessary. Sally later informed me that the feds found enough evidence of corruption and were honoring that agreement. Almost 6 weeks after I decided to sell my house, I woke up to a special news bulletin airing on all the major news channels. The feds had arrested everyone involved in Jonathan's misuse of Heather, charging them with a range of offenses, including misuse of funds, corruption, misconduct, campaign violations, and racketeering. Jonathan was arrested for misusing campaign funds, accepting illegal donations, and selling rights to appointive positions in his anticipated administration. Heather, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, was also arrested for her involvement. I called Sally as soon as her office opened to learn more. She said that the information leaked had come from sources other than me, which meant Jonathan's payout to me was safe. He couldn't reclaim the money, and if he attempted to sue me over the non-disclosure agreement, I'd likely win, since the news attributed the tip to 2 campaign staffers. I hoped I wouldn't be suspected of exposing union officials, as I didn't want any trouble from unsavory characters showing up at my door. I smiled, recalling how I had discreetly slipped incriminating notes and documents into the papers some staff handled when I was supposedly at the office looking for Heather. After finishing my call with Sally, I leaned back in my chair, satisfied. I had gotten my revenge on Jonathan and freed myself from Heather at only the cost of attorney fees. Plus, Jonathan's settlement had made me $1.7 million richer. Now, I could look forward to finding a decent woman to marry and starting a new chapter in my life. After those tumultuous events, life settled into a new, quieter normal. I had moved to a smaller, modern apartment that held no memories of my past with Heather. The sharp pain of betrayal dulled over time, leaving behind a deep sense of resilience. The news cycles continued to churn out updates on Jonathan's downfall, the investigations, and the trials of his associates. Heather's involvement was minor in comparison to the political heavyweights, but seeing her name associated with the scandal still sent a twinge through me. Doug and I continued our friendship, stronger now than ever before. He helped me reconnect with a sense of stability, arranging dinners and casual nights out that reminded me of simpler times before ambition and deceit had complicated everything. His loyalty and support were unwavering, a constant anchor. One crisp autumn evening, I stood on the balcony of my new place, watching the city skyline fade into twilight. The air felt different, lighter. For the first time in a long while, I breathed, without the weight of uncertainty pressing down on my chest. I'd learned that trust was fragile, ambition could consume, and loyalty was the rarest of virtues. A month later, while volunteering at a local charity event Doug had encouraged me to attend, I met someone new, Elena, a soft-spoken artist with kind eyes and an infectious laugh. Unlike the whirlwind that had been Heather, she exuded a calming energy that made every conversation feel like a quiet escape. I didn't rush into anything. I had learned the value of patience. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I found myself opening up, letting the cautious tendrils of hope take root once more. Life had changed, irrevocably and painfully, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and unexpectedly ready for a new beginning.